Aloha and welcome back to the Kauai Real Estate Podcast. This is part 2 in the August 2024 purchase contract contingency review. We're talking about the changes and additions to the purchase contract that's released in August 2024. We left off in section E. We're going to start off in section F. I do want to note, in case you didn't listen to the prior episode, my podcasts generally are kind of a wing it style. These contract contingency change ones are a little more serious. So I do have an outline and I'm going to try to stick to it. I apologize in advance if I sound a bit like a robot, but I want to make sure to get these done fairly accurately. Well, I'd like to get them done perfectly accurately, but we're all human. At any rate, let's jump into the contracts. The F1 closing and the F2 scheduled closing date have been revamped. Of course, there's the ever-present change to the word will instead of shall that we've seen throughout, but also a change to closing date for the title instead of scheduled closing date. The most significant addition, though, is that F1 now includes, should either party fail to sign and deliver to escrow all of the required documents to record within the time frame required by escrow to record on the closing date, then either party may terminate this purchase contract. Yikes. I hope there isn't weather on the mainland or anything that delays or impedes FedEx. Of course, nothing against FedEx. There is still, though, an F3A one-time unilateral right to extend. This is choice in the contract. You can say when you're writing the offer and agreeing to the contract whether or not there'll be an extension available. The extensions are negotiable. Typically, they're 10 or 15 days. But let's talk about this contingency in the current contract as though it was written for 10 days. Basically, this contingency would allow either party to extend that 10 days, but once or up to those 10 days. But once one person does, so for example, let's say the buyer extends 10 days, then the seller cannot extend an additional 10 days. There was a little tricky section in here that said, if either party extended all or a part of it, it was gone. For example, if the buyer just extended 3 days out of that 10, the seller couldn't do the other 7. Now, in the new contract, still using the 10-day example, if one party extends for less than the 10 days, the remaining days are available to the other party. So in that example, the good news is they did leave out the part about the timeframes from this extended closing date. Anything in the contract measured from the closing date will be measured from the extended closing date. For example, if the J3 final walkthrough is 3 days prior to closing, it'll be 3 days prior to this new closing date. It will not be 3 days prior to the original closing date. Let's move on to F8 assessments. The biggest change is that the seller who has an assessment being paid on their property, for example, if there's a condo assessment to redo the roof and the seller's paying a certain amount, we need to know if those installment payments have a known end date or a known lump sum payment option, because those will be negotiated to be paid in full by the seller or prorated by escrow. But now there's a section that there wasn't in the contract before that says if an assessment is being paid in installment and does not have a known end date or a lump sum payment, it will be prorated, period. Okay. Let's move on to F12, keys to the properties. That changed just a little bit with the addition at the beginning stating notwithstanding any other written agreement, just to make sure you have the option to adjust this contingency accordingly. The same old shall change to will, and the caps for the closing, and I mean capital letters for the first letter of closing. And now mailbox is one word. Silly change, but still, we're talking about changes. Again, I don't know why I keep using the word silly. It's not really appropriate for contracts, but bear with me. Hang in there. Let's move on to section G. The preliminary title report section has a little clarification for the language to state it's a preliminary title report or commitment. There's also a clarification in G2 that the property will be insurable, and the same change from shall to will. H1, no contingency on cash funds, and H2, contingency on obtaining cash funds, both have a lot of change. These changes are mostly about the language. Key change in H1 is the specific stating a failure by the buyer would constitute default. This allows the seller to terminate and bring action for damages, breach of contract, or retain the earnest money and additional deposit. H1 also added the option of lender verification of cash funds as a pre-checkable option for how you're going to provide that verification to the seller. H2, contingency on obtaining cash funds, added some options for obtaining hard money or a private loan. And I guess that's just to clarify that buyers purchasing with hard money or a private loan still have a contingency. It can't be written as a cash offer. It has to be a cash offer contingent upon another action. The H3 financing contingency had some language changes from commitment letter to approval letter for both conditional and final loan approval. So H4 buyer obligations relating to financing just had some language changes and separated out the appraisal portion for conditional loan approval letter to a separate section from the letter and a separate item that states evidence of an appraisal or property valuation method satisfactory to lender has been received. It's a little different than the old contract that required that the appraisal had been reviewed. I'm sure this was to accommodate the fact that a lot of conditional loan approvals were provided prior to the appraisal. So this just makes an accommodation for the appraisal. The seller's disclosure section added some language that if the seller doesn't provide it within the time period, unless the seller is exempt from providing a seller's disclosure, the buyer can cancel. I3 of the disclosure section, it now combines the receipt of disclosure, amended disclosure, or buyer's later discovery of inaccurate information. These were two contingencies in the prior contract. Either way, the buyer's review period starts from the delivery of the disclosure, delivery of the amended disclosure, or when the buyer discovers that the statement failed to disclose a material fact or inaccuracy that, and I'm going to quote here, directly, substantially, and adversely affects the value of the property, and if buyer was not aware of it. Section 1, pre-printed in the contract, just has a few language changes about building permits. It now includes, quote, buyer becoming responsible for the following items upon conveyance of the property, unquote, and now has the same list as before. Assume responsibility for fines, discontinued use, inability to rebuild, and requirement to remove or rebuild the affected area. The asbestos disclosure section now includes wall materials. There is a little addition in M for abandoned wells. Just some minor little language things. When I say minor, I just mean the word changes were minor. It doesn't mean that the item itself is a minor item. J9 cleaning. This is one of my favorite ones. We now have the fantastic addition of the option of a cleaning credit in lieu of cleaning. I love this. J10 pet treatment is now called animal-related treatment. It's still about the treatment of fleas and ticks by a licensed pest control operator. Requires that 1, the animals are removed, 2, the carpets are cleaned, and 3, then there's the treatment. But now this is a specified due date, negotiable due date, but specified before closing as opposed to days after closing in the prior version of the contract. We're now on to Section K, and the K2 survey has some language changes, but most importantly, the removal of, quote, if improvements exist along the property line, unquote. The big change is in the K3 boundary encroachment. In the old contract, if there was an encroachment, the buyer would instruct the seller, and the seller would use reasonable efforts to remove or obtain an encroachment agreement, the seller's sole cost. However, within a certain time frame. The new contract allows the buyers to cancel within a certain number of days of discovery. That's a negotiable number, but probably will be 3, 5, 7, whatever. If the encroachment is remedied, then the seller has to provide a corrected survey. So basically, if the buyer doesn't cancel or agrees to a correction, once the encroachment is remedied, the seller needs to provide a corrected survey if K2 survey was used earlier in the contract. K4 also has more clearly stated that an amended disclosure is required if there's an issue that's discovered. It is, this has kind of been interesting. Throughout the contract, I've noticed that they're very, or much more so clear about when an amended disclosure is required. That language was in the prior contracts, but it was kind of buried in there. So a lot of times agents didn't have their sellers amend the disclosure, but it is much more prominent in this contract. This episode seems a little bit long and it's a lot of information to take in. So let's stop here again, and I will have the next part of the purchase contract changes and contingencies very soon for you. Thank you for listening. I welcome any questions. Again, I know this is a lot to take in. I appreciate you hanging in there with me, and I look forward to writing great offers with great agents and great clients. Have a wonderful day. Mahalo for listening.